Hi there, everybody. I'm Charlie Beckett. I'm responsible for this. but I should say straight away, echoing what David says, thank you to Fabio, who was the researcher on this project, and to Mattia Peretti, he's the manager, is the title, but my God, he's so much more than that, as people who know and work with Mattia know. One of the things I've learned over this last year is that it's really good to have more Italians in your life. I also want to say thank you very much to Hackers for hosting this, because I've been coming to these events for quite a few years. I can remember when this was trendy. And this sort of intersection between so-called technologists and so-called editorial, I think, is really important and fruitful. I spent 20 years as a very traditional journalist, and I spent about 15 years working at the LSE, very much on this future of news thing. And this report is absolutely about how that those two cultures, if you like, can collaborate, can cooperate, and make something good. So thanks very much for coming. The report, get there, new powers, new responsibilities. This has been a fantastic time. As David said, it sort of emerged last autumn. And I've been thinking about AI and reading all those complicated articles about deep learning and natural language processing and stuff, and didn't really understand it. And David rang me and said, why don't we try and do something, do a report? And I said, no, I don't understand it. But this has been an extraordinary year where I feel I do understand it much better, and it's not because of my intelligence. It's very much the intelligence of the people that have been involved in this whole process. And it's been an extraordinary process over this year, where we've surveyed people at great length and in great depth, and had incredible conversations in workshops. So I'm incredibly grateful to the people. But I'm also kind of surprised, because over this last 10, 12, 14 years, sometimes it's been quite an effort to get journalists and technologists to talk about these difficult things, to talk about it in an open. But I think, tonight, we've got a massive waiting list. There are people out there in the cold and the rain who want to be in here. And I'm very excited about the fact that people do want to be part of this conversation. The report it took whatever it was, a year to make. And you can now read it online. It's 101 pages, which sounds a lot, but the font is quite big and it's color-coded, so you can scroll through it. You can even read it on your mobiles, but not now. And there's an exec summary, and there's a glossary, and there's a really good reading list as well. And the point of it is very much that we hope that it will introduce you to what people are thinking and doing, but will spark off a conversation. We're very keen that this becomes a network of people who are interested in it. We took quite a bit of time at the beginning of this report to attempt to sort of define what we were talking about. Before we talk about artificial intelligence, perhaps we should sort of define our terms, as we say at the LSE. We took a very broad definition. It was quite all-encompassing, but in practice what we were interested in was how news organisations themselves thought about AI, how they defined it. Because of course, the dirty secret is that pure artificial intelligence does not exist. The HAL computer in 2001 Space Odyssey, thinking for itself independently, does not exist. So in practice, we were talking about machine learning, automation, bots, data processing, and so on. But we did think that it was very important that people had a sense of how they were going to define it. And that was very much the feedback that we got from the respondents to our survey. We were asking them, and you are about to hear from some brilliant people who are doing this stuff, and they're doing it incredibly well in interesting ways. So we're asking them about how they are doing it, how are they adapting to these new technologies. But we're also really interested, obviously, in why it's tough. what are the challenges that you're facing, as well as what the opportunities that you are discovering. And also, we were very interested in this last bit, which was, what are the financial implications? Journalism is incredibly hard-pressed financially in terms of resources. What difference can AI make? We were super interested in the ethical ideas, and by that we meant it in a very broad sense, in terms of trust, for example, around journalism. What difference can AI make to that? And we were also interested in the idea of what implications are there for editorial policy. How is this going to change the kind of journalism that we make? And to be honest, that's the bit that I'm super interested in, because I do think that we are conscious that journalism is struggling. We're struggling for attention, we're struggling for credibility at a time when we only have to look around the politics, for example, of the world at the moment, when we're struggling for good information and reliable, good debating forums for our lives. So we were asking them about what they were doing, but also what they were thinking about AI and journalism. It was a global survey. I was incredibly, again, one of the sort of surprises, and it's probably my ignorance rather than anything else, but the important thing about this is the spread of AI. Of course there's a Western bias. Of course there's a bias towards the richer, technologically advanced organisations, but this is something that is now spreading across the world. Yes, there are big gaps, and we're hoping to fill those gaps as we continue with this project over the next year or two. So again, what was surprising was the innovation in different regions. So that the whole kind of creativity that we're hoping to follow up on. We also worked hard to try and get as many different types of news organisations involved. So-called, we used to call them newspapers, didn't we? Newspapers, broadcasters, news agencies, magazines, and lots of different kinds of news organisations within that, specialist fact checkers or investigative organisations. And within the news organisations, of course, we tended to talk to people who were interested in AI, because they're the people who are doing it. But we tried to get the spread, because again, it's just so important to reflect the fact that AI is not just about the digital team. It's about every part of the newsroom. So we hope that we're giving you a quite varied, nuanced picture of what news organisations are doing. So overall, I was enormously, I won't say surprised, but impressed actually by the enthusiasm and thoughtfulness of people who were embarking on this kind of AI journey. Absolutely, the priority was to make journalists' work more efficient. And by efficient, they also meant effective. Secondly, absolutely critical as well, was in an age of kind of superabundance of information, confusion, people not knowing what sources to trust, feeling there's just too much stuff out there for them to cope with. How can you deliver more relevant content to users? An absolute fundamental motive as well. And finally, and not at all unimportant, this idea of improving business efficiency, reducing costs and maximising revenue. So we asked people, we learned from people about how it was actually operating in practice, or how they wanted it to. And again, it spread right through the news flow, right from news gathering, through news production, and of course news distribution. So it's ubiquitous, it's part of every element of the news flow. But I thought what was really interesting was that there was a kind of feedback loop with AI. That when you do something like comment moderation with AI or machine learning, you're doing all three elements in a sense. You're gathering content, you're getting comments, you're producing news, you're producing material for people to read, but you're also, it's part of comment moderation, is part of engagement. So it's part of a way of, if you like, providing a service and responding and being interactive with your audience. So the machine learning has to reflect all those different elements of the news flow. Did people have a strategy to cope with this complexity? A lot of them said they didn't. Which is quite a stark question. 2/3 of the respondents to our survey, and bear in mind these are people who are more early adopter, they're more enthusiastic. When asked this, they said, no, we don't have an AI strategy. A little secret here, actually. Many of them said we don't have a strategy for anything, actually. But do you have an overt strategy for AI? No, we don't. Now, in a sense, that could be a good thing. You shouldn't have a strategy about something that you haven't yet understood. You shouldn't have a strategy yet with something that you haven't engaged with and experimented with. But certainly, I mean, we were quite impressed that nearly 40% claimed to have a strategy. How did they think about that? Well, one of the reasons why it's difficult to have a strategy is because of all the challenges. And these aren't all unique to AI. I mean, people have been through, the first great move online or the first adoption of social media will be familiar with some of these challenges. Fundamental, of course, is a lack of resources. One of the things that struck me when researching around artificial intelligence in general was how tiny the news media is compared to, the R&D resources of, pharmaceuticals, security, or retail, for example. And times are tough. There is a lack of financial resources, but also a lack of willingness necessary to take a punt on this because it is complex and relatively long term. Big message coming out of the research was a lack of skills, painful lack of skills of people who really understood how these things work and how it could apply to editorial, and a desperate struggle about then how do you hire when somebody can walk across London and get hired by the people who own this building, for example, So combine that with, again, something you're probably familiar with, this kind of more cultural resistance. First of all, a general skepticism that AI can do the job better than humans, and a genuine fear of losing jobs or, frankly, having to work harder because of the expectations around this technology. A cultural problem within organisations, which again, people who have been involved in change and technological adaptation are familiar with. How do you get different departments or bits of your organisation to work together to make these things happen? And underpinning that, a real kind of fundamental lack of knowledge, frankly, about AI. Not just not having enough specialists, but generally people having quite a superficial knowledge of how it applies, especially, if you like, to journalism. And that leads to this lack of strategy and a lack of direction. So here's some sort of ideas about how you might approach it if you've not already done so. And I should stress, we're not being prescriptive. These are ideas that we're reflecting from what our respondents said was useful to think about when they did this themselves. So first of all, identify where you're at. What is your state of AI readiness? What do you actually know about it? Secondly, try and understand the kind of AI technologies that are available. And then, I think this is really key, and there's a lot of this in the report, and you'll probably hear more from the people talking later. Reflect on what you're trying to solve. What kind of problems you're actually trying to solve with AI? Because it may well be that AI is not relevant, that there are different ways of solving the particular problems you have. Then obviously think about what areas of your organisation might be helped by AI. And as I've said, that's probably most of your organisation that you have to get involved. Identify the obstacles, seems obvious, but think about how you're going to address those in a systematic way and how critical they're going to be. And then obviously think about the roles and responsibilities of the people across the organisation. And that was one of the really interesting bits in the strategic section of this report, was there are different models. There's not just one template for people to adopt, but if you don't think about it consciously, you're going to get lost. And then perhaps think about picking on one project to experiment with, to start evolving models for dealing with AI before you go all in on it. Perhaps start small. By the way, I'm skating across this in quite sort of general terms. I'm very happy we'll be taking questions. I'll be taking some questions at the end of this, and obviously we'll be talking it through in more detail. But obviously, with a bit that sort of matters for me as somebody who doesn't have to actually do this, I'm interested in what the implications are for journalism. And I think they're really important because I think we've got some quite clear choices to be made, much as we did when we went online or we adopted social media. One of the most obvious ones is AI can make you more efficient. It can save you money. Are you going to just take that money? Very tempting when you're under such pressure, or are you going to use it to invest in the way of making the gains of AI more exponential? Thinking about misinformation. We all know that algorithms, AI technologies are actually quite responsible for the accelerated spread of so-called, fake news and disinformation. And yet we also know that those same technologies can be used in quite specific ways, such as automated fact-checking, to counter it. But more generally, again, what was interesting was how, throughout the newsroom, AI can help build the credibility of journalism and journalists. Trying to get the balance right, another big thread in the report, trying to get the balance between the power of these technologies and human intelligence, the human values, the creativity that your editorial people can bring to bear. This idea of augmented journalism, that you're trying to think of ways that these technologies can actually enhance your journalistic work, can free up time, for example, can give them extra research capabilities, story discovery, and so on. And then another big red light around algorithmic bias. Again, people here, you're probably quite tech savvy. You're probably quite conscious of the idea of gender or ethnic bias in data sets. But there's also, I think, a broader question there for journalism around editorial standards. So the idea of accuracy. What kind of levels of accuracy and reliability in data are you prepared to accept? And also on a positive side, it was really interesting how some of the news organisations were actually using machine learning, data discovery and so on to, in a way, counter the kind of human traditional biases of newsrooms. The narrow news agenda that you might have, the narrow selection of sources that you might have, and how AI might actually broaden and reduce your own biases. Transparency key to this, of course, lovely word, but thinking about how transparency works within the newsroom. How are people AI literate, so they understand what they're using? But of course, perhaps most importantly, for your customers or your public or your users, how much do you need to tell them about how you're using AI technologies in your content creation? And finally, and not least, the idea of who has the power over this technology. Particularly, of course, the tech companies whose algorithms may be involved in the distribution of your content, but also in creating the kind of tools and systems that you're going to need to deploy AI in journalism. So loads of sort of interesting editorial and ethical implications, which again, really pleased about the way that the respondents understood that. So just some thoughts on the way forward. It's difficult to sort of assess exactly how big an impact these technologies are going to have, because they're so complex and they are still evolving so rapidly. And there's so much we can learn, as the report says, from other industries, for example. You know, we're not alone on this. But to me, it seemed that this is another set of structural questions for journalism about how newsrooms are organised, about the culture of newsrooms, you know, the relationship between, for example, the technologists and the editorial staff, and how that distinction really has to be broken down. And perhaps the biggest message, which obviously is very refreshing if you work in a university, is that people felt there was a desperate need for much more education, a kind of general better understanding of how this is happening, what it's doing, what its effects are, and precise, you know, more specialist skills-based training around, you know, data training, for example, around investigative data analysis and so on. And the big surprise for me, fun enough, was this one, which is that, you know, I'm used to a journalistic culture which is relatively insular, at the moment super competitive, and yet there was already really interesting evidence of news organisations collaborating. And it might be with researchers, you know, with people in universities, or it might be between news organisations, for example, on big investigative projects. But beyond that, there was a real appetite for trying to interact more, to share more, to think more about issues such as how do we create some kind of code or guidelines around the ethics of AI and journalism, but also the practical stuff, what works, what doesn't work, or even how might news organisations work together to create the kind of programs or processes that are going to work. So overall, this report is very much not about my opinion, it's about what people are doing out there, what they think is happening, and also very much what they think might happen in the future. And there are a huge amount of choices to be made, huge amount of difficult decisions around investment, and about what your mission is and what you think, or how you think that AI might fit in. I don't think, I mean, I've come out of this definitely thinking that the robots are not going to take our jobs. Sadly, I don't think AI is going to somehow save journalism either. I think this is a complex area. I think that we're looking at a kind of window of 3 to 5 years. What worries me is that we don't have the resources or the imagination to really seize the opportunity. What heartens me, especially from the feedback from this report and the events and so on that we've done around it and the feedback we've got, is that there is a huge appetite, there is an enormous amount of innovation, and I think that this can make quite a significant help to us as we struggle to bring much better journalism to the people that need it so much in a world of misinformation, conflict and confusion. So thanks for that, and I'll take questions if you'd like right now. Thanks. Who would like to start? One at the back. Go.
Yeah. Hi. Looking forward to the report and looking forward to reading it.
Sorry, do you mind just saying who you are?
Yes, of course. Sorry. Rohan Jalasekara. I'm a journalist and occasional techie. I'm like perhaps slightly older than Charlie, but I remember that when new technology was introduced, we either had the advantage of companies, if we're talking about newspaper layout and design, like ATEX or Adobe, who were going to hold our hands, who worked hard on the user interface to make it easy and accessible for journalists, or we were doing web pages that the code itself and techniques like SEO were understandable, so we could hold in our head. are we reaching a point where we as journalists, it's simply beyond us to hold the concepts of AI in our heads in the same way as we could hold HTML, or we could hold a useful interface by someone produced for the purpose like Adobe or ATEX?
Yeah. I think in a way that's a better question for the people that follow on. I think definitely one of the messages that came out of the report was that even those people who knew the technology well were worried about the so-called black box effect, that it's much harder to be certain of what it does. And that's really important. I mean, you only have to watch a bunch of journalists in a data training exercise when they're told it's 80% accurate, and they're told that's great. You know, and they're thinking, whoa, kind of like 100% accuracy. So I can see there are, you know, specific concerns. Where I think you certainly need, as discussed, much more training and much more informed expertise. It's not the same as when you got the 21-year-old intern to start your Twitter feed, you know, and they had a kind of intuitive, it's great fun, let's see how it rocks. And that's partly because I think the investment in making it systematic rather than just a one-off thing is so important. So I think that is you can't beat real knowledge. However, if you look at the way, and you'll hear from the people how they put it into practice, I think when you break it down into its functionality, then I think and if you monitor it properly, you know, if you have editors of the algorithms who are aware of the impact and pay attention to that in a systematic way, then I think it is manageable, you know. I think that, you know, the risks are probably much greater if we were talking about pharmaceuticals, and those industries are adopting practices and coming up with ways of trying to make it more transparent, and we should be paying attention to that. I mean, you know, it'd be quite a good idea, wouldn't it, if journalists were paying more attention to, you know, accuracy and bias and things like that anyway. Yeah. At the back, thank you. How much time have I got, Matea?
2 questions.
2 questions.
Hi, I'm Roxanne, former journalist. Really interested to hear your thoughts on the ethical challenges. You brought up tech companies and the use of AI, and we're here in Google. You're funded by Google, partly. What were some of the ethical challenges that your report and your research churned up, and what were some of the solutions that you were able to find to meet those challenges?
Yeah, I think if you're talking about the tech companies generally, first of all, which ones do we mean? Because again, what was interesting was obviously there's the big beasts, you know, like our friends here, but there are also a bunch of other smaller tech companies. So, for example, quite a number of the newsrooms mentioned, you know, you get people rolling up with a fantastic bit of kit. Would you like to plug it in and go? You don't quite know about their sort of ethical provenance. Yeah, but in the end, it's fundamentally about power. And again, as I mentioned, one of the really important things, I think, is that journalism reflects on how tiny it is within the wider context of this technological development. And as mentioned previously, the fact that this is more, at one level, is more complex technology with, in a sense, not invisible biases built in. You know, they are identifiable. So it was interesting, the respondents were highly realistic. They could also see, for example, that you know, the tech companies are struggling, let's put it in a polite way, are struggling with dealing with algorithmic bias. So in some ways, the news industry has a lot to learn from how they're doing that. You know, they should be paying attention to how other organizations, be they tech companies or, you know, other bodies using AI, are trying to struggle with that. You know, this is not for journalism alone. What I would say is that surely there's a role here for little old journalism, which is supposed to be good at critical accountability processes, to get involved with this, both in terms of how it uses AI, but also how it reports on AI. I think we should get over some of the kind of scare stories, and we are. There's, it's great. This is a whole new area of journalism. So I think the way that we, or journalists, adopt AI and think about the ethical implications and so on, but also how they report upon it, could be a really useful function that could build credibility for us. And frankly, journalism wasn't some unsullied, trusted organisation before this tech came along. We had our credibility problem before that. So I think, in a sense, it's an opportunity, if you want to get across this and get properly informed and be critical, that it's better to be engaged than it is to abandon the terrain, if that makes sense. We've got one more, Matthias says, and he is the boss of my whole life. Sorry, yeah, chap at the front, sorry. Just wait for the mic, thank you. Do you mind just saying who you are?
Thank you. Thank you for the great presentation. You mentioned a lot of possibilities, but how about fake news by omission? There are a lot of topics where AI can maybe perform better than journalism, like massive data processing or fake news by omission. So what would you give 5 years for this kind of journalism to be outclassed by AI?
What do you mean, fake news by omission?
Yeah, for example, missing information that AI can find and journalism don't report because they're taking mainstream sources as ground truth.
That's interesting. I think that, I was really impressed by some of the processes and some of the organisations, like, for example, in the UK, Full Fact, the attempt to automate fact-checking and so on, the attempt by organisations to start thinking about how they counter deepfakes. And there was also some interesting work around newsroom tools to help journalists as they're, for example, creating content, to make sure that they're sourcing properly. A lot of tools that can help them not be distracted by disinformation and so on. So there's some stuff that they can do themselves, but I think that actually, and journalism can do a lot more work on, if you like, countering disinformation. But I think what in a way might be more interesting for journalism and AI is the bit about how it helps people connect to the kind of relevant information that they need, so that they're not at the mercy of their Twitter stream, or they're not at the mercy of search results, that journalists and the public are able to interact better to get relevant, timely information to people that is demonstrably credible. So in a sense, I'm not saying don't worry about so-called fake news, but I'm saying that there's a lot more that news organisations can do to improve the credibility of their content and to connect people to it. And you're going to hear a lot more of that from people later in the day.